The transport vessel shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of Kepler 440b and Lieutenant. Commander Jake Morrison gripped the armrest while watching the violet clouds swirl past the viewport because this was his first deployment to an alien contact zone, and the nervous energy in his stomach felt like a swarm of insects. Debriefing had been minimal and classified, but Jake knew enough to understand that humanity had made contact with an advanced species, calling themselves the Zithian Collective. And unlike every disaster scenario from old Earth science fiction, these aliens seemed genuinely interested in peaceful cooperation, though something about the whole situation felt too convenient, too easy. Beside sat Dr. Amy Winters, a xenobiologist, with sharp green eyes and an even sharper mind, who had been studying the limited data transmissions from the Zitherians for the past 6 months, and she kept muttering calculations under her breath while her fingers danced across her datapad screen. Landing was smooth, and when the airlock hissed open, Jake felt his breath catch because standing in the reception bay were 3 Zitherian females, and they were absolutely stunning in a way that made his trained military discipline waver for just a moment. Central figure stepped forward with fluid grace, and her skin had an iridescent quality that shifted between deep purple and silver, depending on how the light hit her, and her eyes were large and luminous like polished amethyst. And when she spoke, her voice had a melodic quality that seemed to resonate in his chest. "Welcome, Commander Morrison and Dr. Winters. I am Kalera, primary diplomatic liaison for the Zitherian Collective, and these are my colleagues Neria and Valera. And we are honored to host the first extended human delegation on our world." Jake managed to find his professional composure and stepped forward, extending his hand in the traditional human greeting, which Kalera accepted with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, and her hand was warm and slightly cooler than human temperature, but not unpleasantly sud facility. They were led to was a marvel of organic architecture where walls seemed to grow rather than be built, and bioluminescent plants provided soft ambient lighting that changed color based on the time of day. And throughout the tour, Kalera remained close to Jake, explaining various aspects of Zitherian culture and technology, while her eyes frequently met his with an intensity that felt distinctly personality. Pulled Jake aside during a break in the tour, and her expression was troubled because something is not adding up, Commander, and the energy readings I am getting from this place are off the charts, but not in any spectrum we have encountered before, and every time I try to take detailed scans, one of them politely redirects my attention. Had noticed the same subtle redirections, and the way Naria seemed to always position herself between Amy and certain doorways, or Valara would start an engaging conversation whenever they approached specific sections of the facility, but he also recognized that humanity was the newcomer here, and some level of security was to be expected. Ted 8 evening, Kalera invited Jake to join her for what she called a traditional Zitherian meal in a private chamber, and the room was circular with a domed ceiling that displayed the night sky of Kepler 4 for 2b and 3 moons hung in the darkness, casting silver light across the landscape. These sat on cushions that molded themselves to body shape, and Kalera served dishes that looked like nothing Jake had ever seen, but tasted surprisingly familiar, with hints of Earth spices mixed with completely alien flavors. "Tell me, Commander, what does Earth look like when you dream of it?" Kalera asked, and her eyes reflected the moonlight, and Jake found himself talking more openly than he intended about growing up near the ocean, and the smell of salt air, and the sound of waves, and the way sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Kalera listened with complete attention, and when he finished speaking, she reached across the small table and placed her hand over his and said, "Your world sounds beautiful and lonely and full of wild, dangerous things, and I think perhaps that is why humans fascinate us so much, because you come from a world that tried very hard to kill you, and yet you survived and thrived and reached for the stars." Anyway, there was something in her tone that made Jake pause because it sounded almost wistful, almost sad, and he was about to ask what she meant when she smiled and said, "Tell me, you have been waiting for this," and she stood and moved around the table with that liquid grace. Jake felt his pulse quicken because the diplomatic protocols were very clear about maintaining professional boundaries, but Kalera was looking at him with those luminous eyes and slowly unfastening the clasps of her shimmering garment and smiling in a way that was unmistakably inviting. stood as well in his training ward with very human attraction, and he said, "Kalira, I do not think this is appropriate given our positions." And she laughed softly and said, "Oh, Jake, you humans are so concerned with rules and positions and appropriate behavior, and that is admirable, but also..." Limonench stepped closer until there was barely space between them and said, "What if I told you that this is part of our diplomatic process and that physical connection helps Zetharians understand other species on a fundamental level, and would you refuse such an important aspect of our cultural exchange?" It was a compelling argument and probably complete nonsense, but Jake found his resolve weakening because Kalira was beautiful and alien and mysterious, and everything about this situation felt like walking a knife edge between diplomatic disaster and something else entirely. Instead, he took a step back and said, "With all respect, I need to understand what is really happening here, because Dr. Winters has concerns about energy readings, and there are sections of this facility we have not been shown, and I need to know what the Zetharian collective wants from humanity." Beyond simple Kuparash and Kalas, expression shifted and the playful seduction disappeared, placed by something harder and more calculating, and she said, "You are more perceptive than we anticipated, Commander, and perhaps that makes you dangerous, or perhaps that makes you exactly what we need to move to the domed window," and gestured at the 3 moons and said, "Do you know what those are, Jake?" And he said, "Moons, obviously." She said, "No, they are prison colonies, and each one houses millions of Zetharian males who were deemed too aggressive, too violent, too dangerous for our evolved society." Jake felt cold realization washing over him, because 5,000 years ago, our species nearly destroyed itself in gender wars, and the females won, and we rebuilt our civilization as a matriarchy dedicated to peace and harmony and progress. But the cost was that we lost something essential, and now our population is declining and our gene pool is stagnating, and we are dying slowly as a species. Turned back to him, and her eyes were filled with desperate hope, and that is why we contacted Earth, because humans still have that wild, dangerous spark, and your species has both genders living in relative harmony despite all your conflicts and wars, and we thought perhaps we could learn from you, or perhaps we could simply take what we need's implications. Hit Jake like a physical blow, and he said, "You want human genetic material?" And Kalira nodded and said, "We want more than that, Commander, and we want human males to introduce new bloodlines and new traits and new possibilities into our dying species, and we have been studying Earth for decades, waiting for the right moment to make contact." Jake's mind raced through possibilities and consequences, because this was so far beyond his authority or expertise. But he also understood that Kalira had just revealed something massive and potentially dangerous, and he said, "Does Earth Command know about this?" And she smiled sadly and said, "Some of them suspect, but they chose to send you anyway because the technology we have offered in exchange is too valuable to refuse." You moved closer again, and this time there was no seduction in her approach, only raw honesty, and said, "I did not lie about physical connection. Helping us understand other species, Jake and I have been assigned to study you, to learn what makes humans different, to see if your kind could truly help save mine, and I find myself drawn to you in ways that are not entirely professionally wanted. To be angry or outraged or alarmed, but mostly he felt a strange empathy, because he understood desperate situations and impossible choices, and he said, "What happens if I refuse this cultural exchange?" And Kalira said, "Then we try with the next delegation, and the one after that, until we find humans willing to help, or until we die out, complete a light of that." Statement hung between them, and Jake realized this was bigger than protocol or personal boundaries, and he said, "I need to talk to Dr. Winters." And Kalira nodded and said, "Of course, but know that she has already been approached by Neria with similar information, and she is likely reaching the same conclusions you, Jake, found Amy in her assigned quarters surrounded by data screens and scribbled notes, and when she saw him, her expression confirmed everything, and she said, "They are desperate, Jake, and their entire species is collapsing, and they think we are their salvation, and I don't know if we have the right to refuse even." If we wanted, Tathi talked through the night, weighing ethics against survival and cultural preservation, against potential exploitation, and eventually Jake made a decision that he knew would change everything, and he contacted Earth Command on secured channels and laid out everything Kalira had Revioled's response to.